50 million people died from a flu that started in Kansas, not Spain, and when the survivors looked for someone to blame, they didn't look at a virus, they looked at their neighbors. Today, we're unpacking the deep, uncomfortable history of how pandemics breed xenophobia, specifically, how the 1890 Russian flu ignited pogroms against Hebrew communities, how the 1905 proof that germs cause disease supercharged that fear into something far more dangerous, and what a pattern stretching across centuries tells us about our own moment right now. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why scapegoating during a health crisis isn't random cruelty. It's almost structurally predictable. And that's the part that should keep you up at night. I've got someone here who has spent serious time in this history, so let's get into it. What is the actual through line connecting a pandemic in 1890 to the Holocaust?
The through line is fear meeting a ready-made explanation. And in 1890, the ready-made explanation was theological. Disease, for most of European history, was understood as divine punishment, not a biological event, but a moral verdict. So when the Russian flu swept across the steppe in 1890 and killed roughly 1.5 million people worldwide, the question on everyone's lips wasn't what pathogen caused this, it was what sin caused this.
And that framing, disease as punishment, that's not fringe thinking in 1890. That's the mainstream.
That is the mainstream. Every major religious tradition had a doctrine connecting disease and sin. And for 2,000 years, sermons across Christendom had used the Hebrew people, the people the research calls Hebrews, not Jews, and we'll get to that distinction, as object lessons in moral failure. Priests weren't preaching hatred, they were drawing on scripture to exhort their own communities. But after 2,000 years of that litany, the effect was that Hebrew communities were rhetorically positioned as sacrificial lambs in the public imagination.
So when a pandemic hits and people are terrified and looking for a cause, that 2,000-year rhetorical setup becomes a loaded gun.
Exactly. And the research frames it precisely that way, not as a political movement, but as a sociopathic response to an existential crisis. Pogroms in Eastern Europe following the 1890 pandemic weren't organized ideology at first. They were panic. They were communities in the grip of an invisible, lethal threat, reaching for the nearest explanation their culture had given them.
And we saw a version of that in our own lifetimes, right? During COVID, Asians across the globe were subjected to that same reflex.
The research makes that comparison directly, and it's striking. It notes that the parity between 1919 and 2019 is near perfect. People becoming unraveled on a bus or outside a restaurant because someone wasn't wearing a mask, that visceral, irrational hostility toward a perceived other, that's the same mechanism. The only reason widespread pogroms didn't occur during COVID, the research argues, is because we now know diseases are not divine punishment. That knowledge is the firewall. And in 1890, that firewall didn't exist.
Okay, but I want to back up for a second because you used the word Hebrew instead of Jewish, and the research makes a really specific argument about that distinction. Can you break that down?
Yeah, this is one of the more surprising parts of the research, and it matters enormously for understanding why anti-Semitism takes the shape it does. The word Jew is actually a label coined by Caesar's generals, slapped on a people for administrative convenience. It derives from Judah, one of 12 kindreds in ancient Israel, and if the Torah is to be trusted, Judah's kindred only composed roughly 9% of the children of Israel.
Wait, 9%?
9%. And even if you include the tribe of Benjamin, which remained loyal alongside Judah after a civil war in the 6th century BC, and together formed the Kingdom of Judea, you're still only talking about 18% of the Hebrew population of the Levant being ethnically represented in the kingdom Caesar eventually occupied. The researchers' argument is that the term Jew obscures over 80% of an ethnic group. Hebrew is the noun, Judaism is the religion. Jew is an adjective, and an inadequate one at that.
So the very label used to target people for persecution is itself a distortion of who those people actually are.
The research goes further than that. It says the term Jew is itself anti-Semitic because it performs exactly the kind of cultural obscuration Caesar intended. And there's a fascinating wrinkle here. The research points out that there are more descendants of Israel living and worshiping as Israelites in Lebanon than the modern state of Israel is willing to recognize. The Israelites of Samaria, who have lived there since the civil war around 600 BC, insist they practice the authentic religion of Moses.
That's wild. So the Good Samaritan of the New Testament could literally be a descendant of Israel. The research raises exactly that possibility. And it connects to why Hebrew communities were so ethnically cohesive in diaspora, which is the thing that made them targets. After Caesar's generals rounded up the aristocracy, clergy, and nobility of Judea following the uprising sparked by the crucifixion, they were force-marched to the most distant frontiers of the empire, along the Danube and the Rhine, and they carried with them a 400-year-old covenant formed in the Exodus from Egypt. Never again would they become lost to their origins and their creed.
And that cohesion, that refusal to fully assimilate, is what generated resentment across centuries. Precisely. The research puts it plainly, all others assimilated, why not the Hebrews? And you'd think Christians would be first to answer that challenge. A deal is a deal, and when you make a covenant with God, you keep it. But that truth was obscured by centuries of sermons in which Hebrews were used as proxies in social commentary. No malicious intent required. The effect accumulated anyway. So we've got this centuries-long rhetorical setup, and then 1890 hits with a pandemic. But the research suggests 1905 is actually the real turning point. What happened in 1905?
1905 is when the divorce between religion and science became final. That's the year it was proven, not theorized, proven, that diseases were not punishments from God, but the biological consequences of pathogens. Robert Koch and Erwin Smith had already been doing the groundwork. Koch had demonstrated that Papua New Guineans appeared to have acquired immunity from the worst effects of malaria and cholera, leading him to speculate that immunity could be conditioned through limited exposure to pathogens. But 1905 is when the proof landed.
And that should have been purely good news. Diseases have a biological cause, not a moral one. That should have ended scapegoating.
You'd think, but here's where it gets genuinely dark. Koch's research also included the suggestion of hereditary immunity, the idea that some populations had biological resistance that others didn't. And when that idea collided with the eugenics movement already gaining momentum in European academia, it didn't end scapegoating, it scienticized it. Now, others weren't just morally suspect, they were biological threats. The fear didn't go away, it got a laboratory coat.
That is a genuinely terrifying pivot. From God is punishing us through them to science confirms they are a biological danger to us. And the research frames this as part of a larger pattern, what it calls epiphanic thresholds in scientific history. Every time humanity crosses one of these thresholds, gains paradigm-shifting knowledge, the cognitive dissonance among the intelligentsia produces social upheaval and human rights abuses. And crucially, each upheaval is worse than the last. It's described as a ratcheting mechanism. The lens, the telescope, the microscope, germ theory, each discovery opens a wider gap between what people believed and what is now demonstrably true, and that gap fills with fear and violence. So the Holocaust isn't an aberration. It's the logical endpoint of a centuries-long pattern of institutions failing to manage the dissonance that comes with new knowledge. That is the core thesis of the research. And the failure isn't just political, it's academic. The research diagnoses it as a consistent failure of peer review. Hypothesis gets presented to the general public as settled science instead of mere hypothesis. And when pseudoscience gets the imprimatur of academia, it becomes extraordinarily dangerous.
Okay, so let's bring this into 1918, because that's where everything accelerates. And I want to start with something that genuinely surprised me. The Spanish flu didn't start in Spain.
Not even close. The research is clear on this. The H1N1 virus that became the 1918 pandemic originated in Kansas City, Kansas. As early as 1915, horses being shipped to Europe to resupply allies were dying in high numbers from what was then called shipping fever. Bosiant. A year later, the virus made the zoonotic leap from horse to soldier. It incubated in the trenches of World War I and was carried to every nation on Earth when the soldiers came home. And the scale of what followed is almost impossible to hold in your head. The research puts the pandemic death toll at 50 million people between 1918 and 1920.
50 million. And the research is careful to contextualize that alongside the war itself, between 13 and 21 million people died in World War I, with a 7 million soul margin of error that the research notes is itself a staggering indictment of the scale of destruction. Add the pandemic, and you're looking at over 71 million deaths attributable to this era, and that's before Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, and Mao even took the stage.
71 million. Before the main act.
Before the main act. And the pandemic didn't just kill people, it destroyed trust in every institution simultaneously. The research describes how a new medium, radio, was taking over. Photographs from the trenches had already shattered the romantic mythology of warfare, and into that vacuum of institutional trust stepped the intelligentsia of Café Central in Vienna.
Tell me about Café Central, because this is one of the most remarkable details in the research, the actual people who were in that room.
So, around 1910, in a thick cloud of opium smoke, Alfred Adler, Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin, and Dmitry Mitrinovich, as well as Vladimir Lenin in absentia, were meeting at Café Central in Vienna. They were planning what the research calls a global war of extinction. The revolution to come, they agreed, had to be sudden, violent, and catalytic. The world's royalty, nobility, aristocracy, and bourgeoisie would be eliminated in one fell swoop. And on the periphery of this gathering was a loner named Adolf, soaking it all in from a table across the room.
That image is haunting. Hitler sitting at the edges of the room where the architects of the Bolshevik Revolution are planning everything.
And the research asks a question no Hitler biography has apparently ever asked. What was he thinking in the trenches of World War I? He was a messenger in Kaiser Wilhelm's army. He watched the British field tanks for the first time. He witnessed carnage on a scale that had never existed before. And the research suggests he could not have failed, later, to connect the dots between Trotsky and the outbreak of the war. Adolf's was a grudge written in blood.
Now, I want to spend a moment on Leon Trotsky specifically, because his story is one of the most tragic and complicated in this whole arc. He was born Lev Davidovich Bronstein.
Lev Davidovich Bronstein, a Ukrainian Hebrew who literally carried the name of King David in his name. And the research makes a point that is both precise and devastating. Lev did not internalize his portion of the Torah. He grew up hearing hymns from neighboring churches recounting the plight of the Hebrews and their cycle of sin, repentance, and deliverance. He watched his people subjected to cyclical, sociopathic violence, and he concluded that Judaism itself was the problem, that the written Torah was a catalogue of every societal sin committed in Israel's 4,000-year history, and that catalogue was being weaponized against his people.
So he didn't hate who he was ethnically.
He turned his back on the religion he blamed for making his people a target. The research puts it exactly that way. Hebrews today describe Bronstein as a self-hating Jew, but the research argues that accusation masks the underlying reality. Lev made a covenant with science instead of God. He became convinced that through social science, the tyranny of religion could be ended and everyone could be friends. He dreamed of a rational world where religious dogmas could never be turned against innocent people again. And in a cloud of opium smoke in Vienna, he became Leon Trotsky, convinced he was humanity's savior.
And the research connects this to the bar mitzvah tradition in a way I found genuinely fascinating. This idea that the Torah was originally an oral document, a living thing held in human memory.
This is one of the most remarkable tangents in the research. In the last century BC, phonetic writing had just been introduced, and a movement to document the Torah in writing for the first time was underway. The Sadducees and Levite priests were leading that effort. The Pharisees were furious, because until then, the Torah existed in the living memory of every male child born to an Israelite. Young boys were educated by teachers and required to memorize, then recite from recall, their assigned portion of the religious canon. The research notes that Tibetan and Hindu monks still do this today, memorizing and reciting in original Sanskrit.
And the bar mitzvah, the day a boy could recite his portion from memory, that was the moment he became a man of the law.
Exactly. The Pharisees called the memorized Torah the living Torah, a document permanently tethered to a conscience. And the research frames Jesus of Nazareth as the John Henry of that information technology revolution, the man who could recite every word of the Torah with no scrolls, no papyri, proving the Sadducees wrong every time he opened his mouth. The ire he instilled in the priestly establishment had less to do with his teachings and more to do with the fact that he could teach at all.
That reframe is genuinely striking. The crucifixion as, in part, a conflict over information technology.
And the research calls phonetic writing the Twitter of that age. In an ultimate defeat, the rabbis in diaspora were forced to live in the new Twitterverse, taking up the Levite scrolls in capitulation to the inevitable technology sweeping the globe. That argument between the living memory and the written record echoed in every shul along the Danube and Rhine for centuries. And it's the backdrop against which all of the later scapegoating occurs.
Okay, so let's bring in the Romanovs, because the research uses Alexandra Romanov as a specific example of someone who actually engaged with the new science of inoculation, and it doesn't end well.
Alexandra Romanov, the German wife of Russia's last Tsar, learnt about inoculation theory before the 1918 pandemic. Koch's research had led scientists to speculate that immunity could be conditioned through limited exposure to pathogens. The research traces inoculation back to Edward Jenner in 1796, who inoculated animals against cowpox, and notes that Louis Pasteur later cited Jenner's earlier claim. Alexandra consulted with those she trusted and had herself and all her children inoculated, a remarkable act of personal courage and scientific trust in an era when clinical results were far from certain.
And those inoculations saved them from the pandemic, but not from the Bolsheviks.
Not from the Bolsheviks. And the research doesn't spare the detail here. As the Tsarina was mentoring her daughters as nurses tending to Russia's wounded and planning her youngest daughter Anastasia's debutante ball, Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky were planning the Bolshevik coup. The Kaiser's own agents, Alexandra's kinsmen, facilitated Lenin's repatriation to Russia in a desperate attempt to sow discord in an enemy's camp. It worked too well.
And what happened to Anastasia and her family is the research doesn't soften it. It doesn't. The research describes it as beyond comprehension. The Tsar's children were not just murdered at point-blank range. They were violated, murdered, and violated again. And the research uses Anastasia's story not for shock value, but as a moral anchor. The argument being that when we realize Anastasia never got to live the life she deserved, we realize none of us have lived the lives we deserve to live. Because the violence unleashed by the Socialist International and the National Socialist Workers' Party altered the natural course of history for everyone. The research actually poses a direct question at the end. What would the world look like if Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, and Hitler had all contracted the flu and died?
It does, and it asks you to calculate that loss. Anastasia's ball, the research says, will forever remain no trivial wish. It's a provocation designed to make you feel the weight of contingency, how close history came to going differently, and how much was lost because it didn't.
I want to come back to the academic failure piece, because the research is pretty pointed about this. It's not just blaming the politicians or the ideologues, it's blaming the institutions that were supposed to catch this.
The research diagnoses the pattern as a consistent failure of peer review. Hypothesis is presented to the general public as science instead of mere hypothesis. And the research uses a specific word for the underlying cause: idolatry. When theologians are more devoted to their interpretations of scripture than to manifest truth, that is idolatry. When scientists are more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth, that is also idolatry. And since everyone is, in some measure, both theologian and scientist, we are all susceptible.
That's a genuinely uncomfortable diagnosis, because it means the failure isn't located in the obviously bad actors, it's located in a universal human tendency.
We believe what we believe for reasons we are convinced are justifiable. When those justifications are exposed as fallacies, we are hard-pressed to abandon our beliefs because we define ourselves too much by what we believe. The research argues that what every major religion instructs, and what peer review of science enforces, is that we are our own worst counsel. Accepting that is the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual to overcome.
And the eugenics piece is where the pseudoscience really metastasizes, right? Because Koch's hereditary immunity hypothesis gets fused with Darwin, gets fused with Malthus, and suddenly you have a scientific justification for deciding which humans are worth keeping.
Erwin Smith's research had confirmed that resistant strains could be bred in plants. Scientists in accredited academia realized the combination of Koch's immunology and Smith's plant breeding yielded what they saw as promising scientific opportunities. Combating pathogens while improving heredity in the population were inevitably suggested together. That is the moment immunology and eugenics fuse. And from that fusion, the proletariat, as the research calls it, emerges as the first and only species of hominid in history to be defined by science. Except it wasn't science. It was insanity. The research describes the people at Café Central as having experienced a psychotic break, becoming convinced they had evolved into a superior species of hominid, and then rationalizing violent revolution in extremely scientific terms.
And the research traces that psychotic break directly back through the chain of epiphanic thresholds, from Ibn Sal's optical lens, through Galileo's telescope, Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope, Malthus, Darwin, Pasteur, and finally to the 1905 proof of germ theory. Each discovery widened the schism between religion and science. By 1905, science reigned supreme among the intelligentsia, but the few following empirical method were outpaced by those publishing pseudoscience in what the research calls an orgy of intellectual ambition.
And COVID-19 is the living proof that this pattern doesn't stay in the past. The research makes that point with real force. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2019 to 2021 was, ominously, 1 century nearly to the date of the 1918 pandemic. And we all watched the same reflex play out. Asians across the globe subjected to the same sociopathic response that Hebrews were subjected to in Eastern Europe in 1890. The only firewall was the knowledge that diseases are not divine punishment. That knowledge held. But the research is asking, what happens at the next epiphanic threshold when that firewall gets tested again?
So when you step back from all of this, the 1890 pogroms, the 1905 pivot, the 1918 pandemic, the Cafe Central conspirators, Anastasia's ball that never happened, what does this really come down to?
It comes down to the gap between what we know and what we can emotionally process. Every time humanity gains paradigm-shifting knowledge, there's a lag, sometimes decades, sometimes centuries, between the discovery and the cultural adaptation to it. And in that lag, fear fills the space. Fear needs a face. And historically, the face it finds is whoever is most visibly other in the community. In Eastern Europe in 1890, that was the Hebrew people, ethnically cohesive, religiously distinct, already rhetorically positioned as moral cautionary tales in 2,000 years of sermons.
And the research's argument is that this isn't inevitable in the sense that it has to keep happening. It's inevitable in the sense that it will keep happening unless the institutions responsible for managing new knowledge actually do their job.
Peer review has to hold. Hypothesis has to be presented as hypothesis, not as settled science. And the research adds something that I think is the most personally challenging part of the whole thesis. The diagnosis of idolatry applies to all of us. Scientists who are more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth. Theologians more devoted to their interpretation than to manifest truth. And ordinary people who define themselves so completely by what they believe that they cannot abandon a belief even when it's exposed as a fallacy. That's the universal vulnerability the research is pointing at.
Here's what this really comes down to for me. The research isn't just a history of anti-Semitism or pandemics. It's a diagnosis of a failure mode that is baked into how humans respond to the unknown. And the prescription isn't complicated, but it is hard.
The prescription is intellectual humility at institutional scale. It's peer review that actually functions. It's the willingness to say, this is what we suspect, rather than this is what we know. And it's the recognition that in a crisis, a pandemic, a war, any existential threat, the instinct to find a human cause, a human face to blame, is almost irresistible. Knowing that instinct exists is the first step to not acting on it.
And the Hebrew people's story is the clearest possible case study in what happens when that instinct goes unchecked across centuries. Not because of anything they did, but because of what they represented in the imagination of a culture primed by 2,000 years of rhetorical positioning.
And the research insists on the correct language as a starting point. Hebrew is the noun, Judaism is the religion. The word Jew, coined by Caesar's generals to obscure 80% of an ethnic group, is itself a form of the distortion that makes persecution possible. Getting the language right isn't pedantry, it's the foundation of seeing people accurately.
We started this episode with 50 million people dying from a flu that started in Kansas. And what the research shows is that the virus wasn't the only thing spreading. Fear spread, blame spread, and the infrastructure for turning that blame into organized violence had been under constructing for centuries, through sermons, through pseudoscience, through the failure of institutions to distinguish hypothesis from fact.
And the COVID-19 pandemic gave every single one of us a personal data point. We all watched people come unraveled on a bus because someone wasn't wearing a mask. We all felt the pull of that fear. The difference between 2020 and 1890 is one piece of knowledge, that diseases are biological events, not moral verdicts. That one piece of knowledge held the line. The question the research leaves you with is, what piece of knowledge will hold the line at the next threshold?
That is the question. And I think the research's answer is that the line gets held not by knowledge alone, but by institutions that protect the integrity of how knowledge is produced and communicated. Peer review isn't a bureaucratic formality. It's a firewall against the next Café Central.
And the research ends with a provocation that I think is worth sitting with. Imagine Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, and Hitler all contracted the flu and died. Write your own alternate ending to 1918, and then calculate what humanity lost because that didn't happen. Anastasia's ball is the researcher's way of making that loss personal. One young girl who deserved to dance and didn't because a clique of intelligentsia in a Viennese cafe convinced themselves they had evolved beyond the rest of humanity.
Anastasia's ball. That image is going to stay with me. And I think that's exactly the point. History at this scale can feel abstract until you find the one human detail that makes it real. Thanks for walking through all of this. This is genuinely one of the more challenging and important conversations we've had on Copilot podcasts.
It's a history that demands to be understood, not just remembered, because the pattern is still running.
The pattern is still running. We started with 50 million dead from a flu that started in Kansas and got blamed on everyone but the virus. We end with a question. The next time a pandemic hits, the next time an epiphanic threshold is crossed and the intelligentsia starts filling the gap with fear, will the institutions hold? Will the language be honest? Will we see people as people or as the face our fear needs? That's not a historical question. That's today's question.